So tonight I'll try and make it nice two halves again. And the first half is really going to think about, carrying on from last week. Last week was thinking about what to do when in the year. And I'm sure it was quite a lot to take on board. And like I said, until you actually match that with your reality and what you're doing. But it does make sense, that kind of underlying pattern of the year. And not to get too far ahead, because we've still got frosts, even like sunny days at this moment. So I'm not planting out stuff yet. So the first half, we're going to carry on thinking about time in terms of the time frame of a plant. And in the second half, we'll think about really how that impacts on pests and diseases. So the proposition really tonight is, if we've got a good understanding of what stage of growth our plants are up to, and we do the right thing at the right time, not the wrong thing, then we're less likely to get pests and diseases. And that's part of this suggestion that pests and diseases should not be seen as a curse and something terrible, but something that we can learn from and amend our practices to actually improve what we're doing. So in that sense, we have to be kind of honest with ourselves, and it might be that if you've bought in plants, then you've got someone to blame. You can blame the garden centre or the nurseryman. But if you're raising your own and something goes wrong, rather than thinking, oh, it's the end of the world, think, now, what have I done wrong? And improve it. And it's, again, trying to encourage us all to think of this subject as a rational scientific subject, where things do have cause and effect, and not just muck and magic where the fairies did it or something. Okay, so first half, I can't help, I'm going to just open up a little bit in the way that I do, in terms of, aren't plants amazing? So this is just a general introduction to get you interested. And, personally, the experience, seeing the seeds come up, seeing things come into growth, it's good for our morale generally, and tapping into a long kind of tradition of humans having actually been growers throughout history, and only in the recent past has that kind of gone out of fashion a little bit. So it's really trying to think, how wonderful plants are, and one of the senses of that is, I like the term renewable, and of course with plants we're talking about genuinely renewable sources of food and energy, rather than the use of the term sustainable, which has just been interpreted economically. So is the budget sustainable? That's all that seems to mean nowadays. But in a more genuine sense, that plants can carry on. And one sense of that would be going back to geology and realising that nearly all the forms of energy that we use in the modern world are actually derived from plants. So we ought to be really thankful to them for giving us gas, coal, even things like peat. But that even though we're terribly advanced in some ways in the world now, that we're still dependent on those old forms of energy. And we've thought a little bit about, and we'll come to this more next week, about green manuring. I've shown you a few examples, but in terms of using plants for soil repair. And that's really, another bigger proposition. When we take on an old allotment, we have to remove the old vegetation, dig out trees, and actually, rather than going straight to trying to get crops out of new ground that's not been cultivated for long, if we sow green manures, they help us to improve the soil, to tame it, to bring it into cultivation. So seeing plants as really useful helpers in that sense in cultivation. And that even relates to industrial landscapes. And there's been studies at Sheffield University about decontaminating land by growing certain types of plants which accumulate certain minerals, and that can be toxins sometimes, and then you can remove some of the toxins from the soil. But that's a very long-term process. You'd have to grow different plants for about 10 years to really get anywhere. But they do use biological means to extract some minerals like copper. 50% of the copper that's produced in the world is actually produced by microbes eating the copper rock and excreting copper. You wouldn't think that, but that's a true fact. And then, my favourite one, last year I did watch a bit of telly, and it was the Chelsea Flower Show. And of course you can understand now that for me that's a kind of another world, a separate world of flowers. And they are starting to do a bit more edibles, so it's kind of starting to go in the right direction. But yeah, watching the Queen go around and seeing her surrounded by all these lovely flowers, beautiful displays, roses and gladioli and whatever. But yeah, in my perspective, it was looking at it and seeing she was surrounded by essentially a load of mechanisms for reproduction. Or you could, if you're James Brown, call them sex machines. Because that's all flowers are trying to do. They're trying to advertise and show themselves off and trying to reproduce themselves. So that's another take on Chelsea Physic Garden. But yeah, also, yeah, in terms of plants' mobility, how plants can move in and colonise ground that's opened up. And that's also reminded me that, yeah, nature abhors a vacuum, that wherever you get an opportunity, something will land and grow. And again, post-industrially, after the Don Valley was closed down for industry, and they bulldozed a lot of the sites, and then the buddleia blew in, or was brought in by birds, and yeah, there was some absolutely glorious sites where you had kind of meadows of buddleia bushes that had been growing for about 5 to 10 years, and all the butterflies absolutely loved it. And so it's seeing, even in the grottiest places, that plants can colonise, take over, and yeah, actually be mobile. And one or two more little things here. Last week we were thinking about the range of plants available to us, and there is that wonderful Oxford Book of Plants at the back, which gives us an idea about the global selection. If we lived in a warm enough climate, all the things we could grow there. But yeah, just keeping it to the links going back between plants and humans. And I mentioned the Irish potato famine as an example, but that's almost a definition of being Irish, in the same way as fish and chips is quite a definition of being British. And yeah, the one variety of potato that was responsible for the Irish potato famine was a variety called lumpers, just a knobbly but very high yielding potato. But unfortunately it was prone to blight, and that had its consequences. And that really is a little reference forward to the second half when we think about pests and diseases, that trying to get the idea of pests and diseases notched up and realise how important it is. And if we were all dependent on food that we grow in a hypothetical future, well, we'd all have to watch out and be very careful not to spread potato blight, not just back to ourselves, but onto all our neighbours and our local area. And for every pest and disease, they can be that serious. So in the future, if there's lots more people growing, then we have to be more cautious, more aware of a lot of those pests and diseases, because if we're more dependent on them for our food, we're going to have to watch out. And then, yeah, a couple more here. Relating to pest and disease, and I'll repeat this in the second half, it's getting across this idea about parasitism and symbiosis. So actually, yeah, we could suggest that there aren't any parasites until the host is killed. So in terms of pests and diseases, especially the pests, most of them have got an interest in keeping their host alive for as long as possible, because if they kill their host, they kill themselves. So I'm just trying to get us to think, rather than thinking of parasitism as a negative thing, well, that's quite rare that you get something that is so virulent that it actually wipes out its host. Most of the time, most pests live in symbiosis with their host. And actually, in some cases, they have to keep their host going or help their host to reproduce. There's a lot of plants that are saprophytic, I think it's called, where they actually live burying their roots into the trunk of another plant, like mistletoe would be an example. And after many years, maybe the mistletoe will kill the apple tree. But it wants to keep its host plant alive for as long as possible. And just before I finish on this, I'll just do one more. And that was, last year, I think it was Radio 4, but they explained, they were talking about quantum science. So this is just kind of appreciating plants on absolutely every level. And there's this quandary, or the latest theories in quantum science are around, is light a wave or a particle? And they found that actually it's both. And that's why it's called quantum, because it seems to live in both universes. If you look at it, it changes from being a particle into being a wave, something like that. And the explanation was that photosynthesis happens because of the quantum nature of light. And if light comes in as a wave and then can be converted into a particle, and plants in their leaves are actually quantum converters of light into energy. So they can allow a wave, light, to come through the leaf and then convert it into a particle to exploit it as energy. And that blew my mind, I'm afraid. So now I look at leaves in a whole new sense, because they're actually changing, they're doing quantum science that the proper scientists still find really hard to do. I'll stop there, but that relates to things like trees as solar collectors. And another glance at the media, there was a design that they put forward for a solar-powered carbon dioxide reduction mechanism. And they built it a bit like solar panels, but it had a kind of trunk, and then it had some kind of branches, and then it had the collector bits for the solar panels, which were like leaves, and they were going to move and face the sun during the day. And I thought, well, that's a tree. And of course, with a tree, you've got the unwanted byproduct of wood and food and leaves. But they were trying to invent this kind of techno version of a tree. And I thought, no, that's foolish. That's trying to copy nature just a bit too much. But that's in terms of just introducing how wonderful plants are. And I'm going to save, it's going to be the sheet on the back of the booklet I'll go on to next. But first, I'll just show you a few pictures. And these are going to be in a sequence which is introducing this concept of trying to identify all the stages of growth, not of any specific plant, but of all plants in general. So, again, one of the challenges we've got, I don't know if anybody's done biology, and might have done human biology, animal biology, or plant biology as a separate subject. And there's all these complex terms like the details of the plants and the stamens and the pistils, and I'm not quite sure myself what they all are. But hopefully, the gift in the first half is to introduce this idea, which we can then apply to absolutely any plant and work out what stage of growth it's up to, and therefore have an idea about what we should be doing at that time, what's the right thing to do for that plant. And again, it's anticipation is part of the answer. It's trying to think, well, it's up to that stage, what stage is it going to go to next? And if I can anticipate where it's going next, then I can act and do the right thing, taking into account that there's a time lag between, say, fertilising or liquid feeding and that actually getting into the plant and having an effect. So once the plant is fruiting, it's a bit late to start thinking about feeding. If it's already halfway through that process, you put your feed on and it's not going to actually be useful. Whereas if you feed when the plant's flowering and being pollinated, then that is going to benefit and get taken up and get fed into the fruiting stage. Right. Can I have the lights, though? Right. Let's come over here without knocking this over. So the first picture on the slideshow is a wonderful collection of beans. And this was actually from my stock of beans, but a friend grew them on a different site. And we've got regular beans like runner beans, green pods, borlotti beans, nice purple bean there. And all the ones at the front, you can see are slightly younger and greener than the ones at the back in small trays. The ones at the back are dwarf beans. These are all French beans. And the ones at the front are climbers. So it's taken them longer to climb up before flowering and setting their seeds, compared to the dwarf ones, which therefore need a shorter season. So if you're interested in beans and you've not grown them before, start with the dwarf ones. And if you're in high ground or further north from here, you'd be more likely to be able to get a crop from the dwarf beans than from the climbing ones, simply because it takes them longer to get established and climb up. So this is both the starting point and the end point of this presentation, and it's just trying to point out, on the runner beans, there was a question and answer last year on the radio, and there was a lot of concern shown by this questioner. What can she do to make sure that she freezes all her runner beans at the right time in the pod? So she's not left them to have beans in. she's picked off every single bean pod as it forms and frozen them all, which is fair enough, and they are food. But these are the legumes, the pulses, and the best value from them is the protein we get when we actually eat the beans. So the answer to the question should have been, actually don't bother to pick all your runner beans, just leave some of them on. And even runner beans, they're like kidney beans when they're fully formed. As long as you boil them up for 20 minutes, you can eat them, and you'll get more nutritional value from eating the actual beans rather than just eating the green pods. It's always nice to have a few young pods when they're just forming. But yeah, rather than get fretful about what am I going to do with all these beans, just leave them on and pick them off. And in some cases, you can even pick them off after the frost when they actually dry out in the cold. They get desiccated, and you still find edible beans inside right through to November, December. So that's the starting point. And obviously, this is seeds. So we're starting with seeds. And here's a nice group of, I think they were Indonesian students who were volunteers at Sheffield Hallam. And they came out on a little work day, and here they are. They've all got some seeds, and they're all spreading on the ground that we've cleared. And that is just broadcasting to create a green manure effect. And you can actually see this one down the bottom right hand corner, that's mustards that have been sown previous to this, and another crop that's only just coming up as seedlings. So we've got this bare soil, and that was a nice symbolic act that they did a bit of hard work, and then as their reward they got to throw a few seeds in, but then they went back off to wherever they came from, and they didn't actually see the seeds germinate. And yeah, here's Julia, who's secretary of the Sheffield Floral Society actually, and this is just illustrating drawing out rows, lines, drills in order to sow some seeds. And you can see, rather than putting a line up and having to imagine that there's a sergeant major standing over our shoulder and we've got to sow in an exactly straight line, with the raised beds we're just putting the drills in approximately the right distance from the edge and walking up and down the path with the hoe and scoring the soil so as to create a little dip to put the seeds in. And in that dip they're going to stay moister for longer and actually a little bit warmer than if they were just at soil level. And also we'll keep the dip after we've watered them in so that we know exactly where they are, where we expect them to come up. Now that's part of soil sculpture, and I'll go into that in more detail next week, so that's a bit more on cultivation next week. And then coming along and watering the same seeds and up and down the row in roughly straight line. The straight line thing is, no matter how straight a line I sow the seeds in, and I did have one client who was OCD, and she spent about an hour lining up a line of peas exactly the right distance apart, exactly in a straight row. But of course, as soon as they grow and they come through, they wobble off and go into a wiggly line. So, and then, yeah, similarly, and again, part of soil sculpture, this is getting ready to plant potatoes. And there is a recommendation that after you've ridged and furrowed a bed, if you are on really heavy, cold soil, a clay soil in a valley, you'd want to plant your tubers into the warmest and driest bit of the soil, which will then warm up in the sun, and that will encourage the potatoes to grow through a bit earlier. Now, I'm on a very light, sandy soil at the top of a hill, and therefore I can get away with planting the tubers into the furrow rather than on top of the ridge. So that's different from standard farming practice, but I can get away with it, and that means that when I come to earth up my potatoes, so they grow up, get a shoot on 6 or 12 inches long, and then rather than having to bring up soil, I can just break these ridges down over the emerging plants and earth them up with great ease. And also we might put extra bulky organic matter and fertiliser into those trenches before we put the potatoes in. And if they're surrounded by compost and leaf mould and fertiliser, that will give a better crop. Later on, they will grow outwards, sideways, to fill the whole bed. And then I'll be trying to fertilise the whole bed if I liquid feed at a later stage. So that's getting potatoes in. And we've probably chitted the potatoes and then just pressing them down into the furrow. And then this is peas just emerging. and you can see the green lines. This is what's happening in a bit more detail. The soil's dried out a bit, although it's decent texture soil. And that's also illustrating, you can see the way the pea seeds are breaking through the soil, and they're actually helped if they can break through in groups. So a little bit tough soil to get through, but where they're coming up 2 or 3 at a time, they're all pushing together all at the same time and pushing the soil out of the way. And so that makes it easier for them to break through and emerge. And yeah, that being a kind of crucial point in the plant's life. In a bit, we could think about, some seeds, once they're germinated, that's when we eat the actual crop. So I'm thinking, if you just sprout seeds, if you start to sprout something like barley, you convert the starches that are in the seed into sugars, and then you've got malt. So just by moistening the seeds, warming them up, you've already created something that's more palatable as food. By this stage, when they're having shoots, if you have bean sprouts, that's what you're eating. You're eating just the newly emerged kind of shoot. And just to show the peas growing through the winter, that's quite a heavy frost on the soil, and these rows of peas have come through the winter and come through the hard winter. Might have had some snow on them, but they're still growing strong. And I've got some that are at that stage outdoors now, which is lovely to see. Great to see that coming on. And terribly blurry picture, sorry, I don't think that's going to get better. That's a little potato emerging with some soil on the leaf. And here's some beans emerging. This might be runner beans. And yeah, the recommendation going further back in Sheffield would be raise your runner beans inside your greenhouse, and you could start doing that now. But then you've got the extra work of transplanting them. Again, if you're on a small scale, you can afford the time to start them off a bit early, make sure they're hardened off after the last frosts before planting them out. But my mate, the plant professor, he raised them in his kitchen last year, and he grew them about 2 foot long before he planted them out. So it was a real struggle to just manhandle them and get them out and disentangle them and all that. So it took him bloody ages. Meanwhile, I just wait and improve my soil, and the more mobile and more improved the soil is, effectively the warmer it is, because the seeds can push through more improved soil. So I tend to just sow my beans directly outdoors, but that means I've got to wait a little bit longer. I don't have to wait till after the frosts, I just have to predict a couple of weeks in the future there's not likely to be a frost, because the beans are below the soil. Therefore, if there's a frost on the surface, they can get away with it for a couple of weeks. And in terms of our calendar, that would be, I might start sowing beans outside by the end of the month, expecting them to emerge 2 or 3 weeks later, which will be middle or end of April, by which time up on the hill there'll be no frost, but there'll still be frosts down in the valley, so watch out. That's beans emerging. And back to potato. This is actually a companion picture for the previous one. This potato had got above ground a bit earlier than the other ones, and this is just the frost that's damaged it and knocked it back. So there's still some green leaf, and there's a shoot, and the shoots of all plants tend to be a lot more frost resistant than the rest of the plant, than the later development of the plant. And when I'm growing things through the winter, if I start things off and they're tiny little seedlings as they hit the cold weather, then they do actually survive better than if they're bigger plants that have grown on and started to form a stem or even gone to flower, in which case they're much less frost hardy. So again, it's timing, that's timing in the autumn to make sure things aren't sown too early and get too big before the frost comes. So actually a bit counterintuitive, but the smaller plants and the emergent seedlings, they're the ones which can stand the frost. And with broad beans and the peas sown outdoors, we had that horrible cold weather in November, and I'd just sown my peas and beans. So they sat there under the snow, under the frost. And then once it all cleared away at midwinter, they emerged when they had a few warm enough days to do that. But yeah, this is showing that despite a little bit of frost damage on some of the leaves, this potato is still going to be able to grow through. And that's, again, in terms of analysing how that plant is, it's still viable. We don't have to chop it all down or give up on it. It's still got viable shoots and a few viable leaves. You might just, if you've got time, take off the damaged bit and the rest will grow through. Here's a gorgeous little, tiny little umbellifer plant, dill, and this was growing through the winter inside a polytunnel. And they got to about this stage. They'd just emerged, and here are the dicotyledons. That's the first leaves, the seed leaves, and they're just flat and straight, whereas later on the foliage is like a fennel plant, millifolium, lots of little bits of leaf on it. And here's some nice basil plants. This is a variety called Nufar. And in this case, I'll have started off the seedlings in the same sized pot, but about 30, 40 seedlings in a small pot, in a warm place. And that will be 2 months before this stage. Once they've emerged, then I've potted them on, and they've each got their individual pot. And this is about a month after potting on. They've started to establish nicely. You can judge from the amount of foliage that they'll have a decent root system, so they'll be filling up the pot by now. And if I don't plant them out within another month, they'll start to get pot bound. But they'll go to a polytunnel and stay warm, marginal outdoors. But yeah, nice bit of basil.
Richard,
yeah.
You know the potting on of the tiny seedlings.
Yeah.
You don't ever sort of save work by planting 1 or 2 in the pot to start with.
The principle there is, yeah, some things do prefer to grow in clumps, like the peas emerging together and pushing the soil out of the way. And yeah, most plants, most vegetable plants, if you give them a bit wider spacing, you can put them in 3s and 4s, and they'll still grow fine. And it's trying to, yeah, just make sure between them they've got enough soil to root out to the full extent.
Yeah.
But yeah,
but I suppose the risk
it is single tomatoes in pots, and there's one where I've just put 2 or 3 in the same pot. In that case, they might be useful to have 2 or 3 seedlings that I can separate later. If I give somebody 3, they can break them up, pot them on, and they've got 3 plants instead. With tomatoes, once they've grown on a bit more, they'll start to have side shoots. So there's a regular leaf. From the base of each leaf, there'll be a side shoot. And if you've got tomatoes that are well ahead in terms of they're well grown ahead of the rest, you can actually make cuttings from the side shoots and get more tomato plants through that as well. And also at the base of these tomato plants, you can just about make out they've got hairs all the way up the main stem. And each time we pot on or plant out, especially in the case of tomatoes, we pot a little bit deeper and plant them out deeper in the soil. And that means from the main stem, those hairs will be converted into more roots. So you get, as well as the roots at the base where the seed was, you get secondary rooting. And there is a proposition how to grow tomatoes by ring culture, that you keep on putting circles with soil in up around the stem as it gets taller and taller, and then it just forms more and more roots. So you've got a stronger plant by having roots higher up the stem. So that's a little tomato plants, ample plum in that case. And yeah, I have got some that are about this stage, but most of mine are a bit earlier than this. So that's that stage. And yeah, a variety of different tomatoes. This one you can see has got a different shaped leaf. That's not cut-leaved. That's called potato-leaved, so it's more entire leaves. In that case, that's Cheatham's potato leaf, a yellow one. But you can see already at this seedling stage, variations in foliage, and you can actually identify different varieties. Some of them thinner, spindlier, some of them bigger, fatter. And this relates to planting out, and again, it's part of soil sculpture. It's a Chinese mustard, and it's actually planted on a slight rise in the middle of that hole, and the ground is pressed in around it, so that when we water, the water goes round in a circle. And again, that's taking the point that all plants would like to have a circular root system below ground and grow out from this point, roots below ground, outwards. And we're moistening more than just the zone where the roots are already. we're trying to encourage the roots to grow out to the next stage. So this is, again, the principle. The plant's at that stage. If it dries out, it'll bolt as a young plant and form a flower and stop forming leaves for us. But we want more leaves from this. So keeping it moist. So it's down in the dip, up on a little moat, with moat around it. And we're making sure we water where the plant's going to need it, not for now, not just for now, but thinking ahead. So that water spacing is going to be enough to keep that plant going for another month and make sure it stays moist and then keeps on producing leaves. And that's on a slightly bigger version. Each one of these has got its own little mound, its own little moat around it. And now you can see another advantage, that instead of watering a whole bed, we're only using the specific water we need around each plant. And that will reduce, especially if we're thinking about protected growing polytunnels, we have to do all the watering ourselves, there's no rainwater, so water is precious, and by hand watering we put on just enough water. And also this method means that you don't have to water in a circle, you can just pour water into one point and it will spread around the plant and moisten the right part of the ground. And that's tomato plants going up to the next stage. So these are about a month older. They've been growing in this greenhouse for about a month and starting to get larger. We can earth the stem up more and more. And that's a nice example there. So at the moment, the tomato plant is quite low down near the ground, but we've already got a stake, and that's, again, for a tomato plant, if we're going to grow them as a cordon or up as a vine, then we're going to need some support. On its own, it won't support that growth. And also, I can't show you on this one, but from now on we'd start removing side shoots. And if we remove the side shoots, all the energy goes into the main growing shoot and we get a tall plant. Whereas if we leave the side shoots on, it turns into a bush with many growing points and it doesn't grow so tall, it would just stay as a bush. And back to potatoes, so they're now emerging and they've been mulched with this very rough twiggy stuff. That's that green waste compost that I was slagging off the other week. Used it on the surface. But again, to mulch the plants. And another point there, the darker the mulch material, the more sun's light and solar energy is going to get trapped in the soil, the warmer the soil will be. And that's one, if you had coal ashes or soot, that's the point at which you could actually darken the soil, darken the topsoil, and then more sunlight will get in and the plants will get away a bit quicker.
You shouldn't really use coal because it's carcinogenic.
That's it, yeah. And here's doing the peas. So again, 2 rows of peas with 2 rows of beans either side. The peas I know are going to grow taller than the beans. They'll grow to about 6-8 foot. Beans about 4 or 5 foot. And also the broad beans require a pollinator to visit them. And if the beans were in the middle and the peas on the outside, the bees would visit the peas but might not get into the beans. So just touchy about trying to get them pollinated in the same way as the sweet corn. And then beautiful earthing up technique using feet. So Sue's just walking up and down the line and brushing a little bit of soil from either side up around the peas. That's before we put the canes in and the string above the canes to support them. And just to summarise that, the peas, they like to grow in a kind of clambering way. They have tendrils on their leaves that reach up and want to grab onto something. Is it happening at the huerta yet, Mick?
Yeah.
Mick's had to put string on the peas at the huerta already because they're up to or just beyond this stage. They start to reach up. So we want to make sure that we put string joining the canes up just above where the peas are now so they can reach up and pull themselves up. Whereas beans, the climbing French beans, they twist around like a runner bean, so they need a straight pole to go up of some kind, or a string, and they'll wrap themselves the whole shoot round, but they don't cling on with extra tendrils. So with peas we have to make sure that the support and the stringing of the peas we keep ahead of the growth, and at certain times they can grow about 1 foot in a week, so we need to put more string on twice a week.
Why do you earth up peas?
So before they rely on their own strength and holding themselves up on the support. By earthing them up, and we've earthed them up possibly 6 or 8 or more inches, that's supporting them and giving them support at the base. So the soil is just anchoring them in the ground, but it's keeping them straight. So these are actually about 1 foot tall, and they've got about 8 inches of soil mounded up around them. That's just meant we didn't have to string them till a bit later.
In that case, do you cover up some of the leaves as you do that?
Well, yeah, lower down,
It doesn't matter.
wouldn't matter, as long as you've got the shoots showing through, yeah. And there's some of the basil that's now been planted out. That's the lettuce-leaved basil. So this is the stage at which all the greens that you've been enjoying each session are at. And I want to keep them at that stage. So for basil, if I let it dry out, then it's going to maybe get more intense in flavour, but more likely to go to flower. And the more I can keep this watered at this stage and happy, and also remembering that nitrogen is the liquid, is the feed to promote leaf growth. So I might put a bit of nitrogen feed on if I want to be really fussy, probably not bother in this case. But yeah, that's a lovely basil plant. That's the lettuce-leaved or Neapolitan basil. And also at leaf stage, this is the tobacco, which I shouldn't really grow, but have done in the past. And this would be the perfect stage at which to actually start cropping some of the leaves of the tobacco, drying it and processing it. This one's actually just a Nicotiana. That's the flower that we get in a lot of gardens. Lovely smell, especially just after dark. But you can see the Nicotiana, which has been bred and grown for flower, has already flowered. These plants are at the same stage, and they're still in leaf. So in that case, I want to promote leaf, and I don't want them to go to flower too quickly. So they've been treated in the right way. And then just an example of where also at the stage after leaf, plants are either going to form a stem and go to flower, or that's the point at which the biennials, which is most of the root crops, will put more energy into forming their root. So they've formed all their foliage above ground, and now they want to store up energy that will then be stored through the winter, and then it's that root store of energy which will help the leaves to build a stem the next year. And the carrot can grow to about 5-6 foot high as a flower. It's got beautiful flowers. So that's one point here. What's happening there? That's a piece of mycorrhizal fungi. It's a huge piece. But that would also be the stage at which the peas and beans are extracting the energy from the leaves and storing it in another form. In this case, it's the nitrogen nodules. But that's a variation on storing the energy just as a root. So the storing energy. And then someone was asking Ruth about the emergent leaves. And what we've got here is these are all the old leaves from last year. And this is horseradish pushing up with its new shoot through the soil. So this is illustrating a perennial that's stored energy in its root, and the root is the bit that we like to eat. But then next year, what's emerging are these leaves, and they've got a serrated cutting edge, like a saw. And I've actually tried to grub that out and weed that out from certain spaces. They will push up through 18 inches of soil. So you leave a stub of root in the ground, and it forms a shoot, and that shoot, with these serrated edges, kind of carves its way up through the soil. Once it's done that, the true leaves are great big flat with no serration. So it has a completely different type of leaf, the true leaf when it's fully growing, in this case compared to the shoot when it's a root. And stem building next. So again, in terms of analysing where plants are up to, this is sweet corn, and in the last month that'll have gone from about 2 foot to about 5-6 foot high, and the flowers haven't quite emerged yet, but the male flowers on the top and the female flowers where the cobs actually form halfway down the plant. So this is the stage at which both I want to think about pollination in the near future and get some hot sunny days. But if I want to feed this crop some more, either by mulching it or liquid feeding it or just spreading a bit more fertiliser around it, I need to put the fertility in now so that in a month's time, when the sweet corn starts to form, it'll be helped by the extra feed. If I leave it to the point when they're actually forming, it'll be too late and the next crop might get the benefit, but not that one. And also stem building, this is the Italian flat-leaf parsley, and you can see these little lengths here where they're building stem just as a precursor to flowering. And of course you can still eat the stems. In fact, yeah, just a general eating point, mostly I'd prefer to eat young shoots, the lighter green stuff of this, and the older leaves, they'll have been around for longer, they'll be tougher, and they won't be so nice to eat. They might be stronger in flavour, but prefer the younger succulent bits, and we'll get more sugars in them. And there's a cauliflower plant which has come through the winter, and so in this case, rather than storing at the root and allowing everything above ground to die back, this plant has got its store of energy in lots of large leaves that will last through the winter and then produce a lovely curd like that about the end of April. So this is, in terms of the sequence that I'm describing, it's a bud. It's not even a flower. It's going to be a flower if we leave it on. But at that stage, it's the stage just before flowering, a bud. And so we're trying, in this case, to promote as much growth at the bud stage. It doesn't matter too much about the leaves beforehand. If I leave a cauliflower to go to flower, this will produce about almost, let's call it 1 million flowers. And what happens is they form too many flowers and they don't all get pollinated and you don't really get many seed back. So if you wanted to keep a cauliflower and let it go to flower and save the seeds, you actually have to cut off about 80% of the flower shoots, or alternatively eat 80% of the cauliflower and just leave a little bit to go to flower, and then the plant is back in balance. And that's telling you how hyper extenuated this stage of growth is in the case of cauliflowers. So they've been bred and selected over and over again, so that this stage of growth will be the peak of growth, and we get as big as cauliflower as possible. That's the sweet corn at the next stage with the male flowers, and in this case it's the blue jade with beautiful red silks on the female flowers down there. Nice bit of companion planting down there. So this is the stage at which I have to make sure that the pollen gets from the male flower down to the female flower. And again, most of the time we don't have to worry about pollination, but being aware that it is happening, and in this case inside a polytunnel we don't get the wind, so I have to make sure that that happens a bit artificially, add a bit of extra help. And here's a nice, this is the peas at the next stage, purple podded peas, bit overexposed, sorry, but again, this is the point I was making last week. If these peas have been grown in good enough, well enough cultivated soil, well enough improved, and crucially, if I water them at the stage when they're flowering, then I'm going to get nice, sweet, succulent pods. If I miss watering at this stage and they get dried out by a drought, then the pods are going to be smaller, tougher, not so pleasant. And like I said last week, more chance of getting pea bean moth, the little maggot you get in the peas. If it's dry and poor soil, you're more likely to get the pest. So that would indicate. And a little bit of Phacelia. This is Phacelia. It's a wonderful bee plant. So this stage of flower in the plant's life, that would be the stage at which pollen is produced and therefore can be collected. They've got amazing little flowers. They start curled up, and every day they open another few flowers up a kind of stem until they're fully extended, long like that with the seeds in. Sorry, that is out of focus. And it's an aubergine flower, which is an entire petal. It's not separate petals. That is one single petal. And I don't think that's going to go in it. It's just no. It's about where it is. Just saying, this is the next stage of growth. This is actually cherry. You can just see a flower with the petals falling off that's been pollinated. And crucially, the little cherries are just starting to form. And it won't take long, no more than about 3 or 4 weeks, before they're big enough, and then a week or two before they actually ripen. Yeah, that's a better picture. So this little white blob here, that's actually a very young, I think it's a nectarine in this case. So that's a tiny little set fruit. Hasn't got a seed in it yet, but that's good to notice that that's been pollinated. And in some cases, we might actually reduce the number of fruits that are setting on a plant. If a plant's a bit stressed, we might reduce the number of fruits that are formed. And apricots forming after from that little germ. Courgettes I've mentioned, especially as an early crop. And this is inside a greenhouse, and I like to grow a couple of early courgettes about a month earlier than I'd expect to grow them outdoors. And often I don't bother to grow the outdoor ones because you can have too much of a good thing in courgettes. But that's just allowing it to grow till all these little fruits that have set have got to about this stage, and that will be about June up to midsummer, before the winter squash come in. And again, you can see what's going on in terms of pollination. This little fruit in the middle, that's a new flower that hasn't opened yet. And there's a flower that is a bit younger. That one's a male with just a stalk on. This one is female, and it's got the ovary that's going to produce the fruit. So we're into fruit, and there's pineapple tomato again, a nice bunch. And of course, by producing the fruit, we've also produced a seed crop. So the seeds are ready inside that. Very nice long cucumber, nice and glossy. If you can, it's another perk of growing your own. You can eat them a bit too young, so that's a lot younger than you'd get in the shop. Hasn't fully formed yet, but again, it's going to be sweeter and more succulent if you can get it at that stage. So the flesh is only starting to get hard at the very top, and that would just melt in the mouth. Cucumber. And again, this winter squash, it is just the ovary, the bit behind where the flower formed on the end there. And in this case, because it was successfully pollinated, it forms a great big fruit. So that's the potential of the flower in itself to form the fruit there. And another white courgette, and that's actually a golden sugar snap pea that I've allowed to get mature. So these are starting to get wrinkly, a bit dried out. I'm now collecting these for seed. I'm growing them on for seed or to use as a pulse. Most of the growth and the foliage is finished, so that will be at the stage at which to collect, to save the seed to grow more peas the next year. And so summarise, the sweet corn is a food crop. If we'd left it on the plant a bit longer till they're fully mature, then it's a seed crop, and we don't have to buy any seeds the next year. And then we're back to the beans. Can we have the lights back on? In a minute, somebody at the back, Laura, can you put some mint in the pot and fill it about 3/4 full? So let's just knock down there a minute. So that was a whole load of impressions of lots and lots of different plants, and it's going to be a bit confusing, but hopefully you can see that sequence from seed to shoot, and then leaf, and then stem, and then pod and flower, and then after flower, fruiting. And it's trying to reckon that out and translate that into every plant you grow will go through these stages of growth. And the way I've done it, the way I reckon it, it is this 8 stages of plant growth. So that's where your diagram on the back of the booklet comes in. And has anybody had a look at this yet, or had a glance? Does it make some sense? So this isn't from another authority. I've just kind of concluded this. Goethe in the 18th century, he did actually come up with something, metamorphosis of plants. And that was all about, can you predict at one stage of a plant what it's going to do next? And again, plants are amazing, but the first seed leaves that emerge look like one plant, and then the true leaves come through and they look like a different plant. And without knowing it, you couldn't have predicted quite what they're going to look like. So there's a kind of a question there. If we go through this just briefly, thinking about what we do and what we can eat at each of these 8 stages of growth. So at the first stage, seeds, we can actually eat seeds simply by reconstituting them, like pulses. We'll put them in water. And yeah, let's go through. Firstly, what about if we try a breathing exercise? I've not done this before, but everybody up for breathing in sync? If we all breathe in one go, and then all breathe out in one go. Let's do that a couple more times. Now, take that experience that you're having of breathing, and the inwards breath, in relation to this chart, is the expansive upwards, outwards. So we're getting bigger when we breathe in. And then the outwards breath is slightly more downwards energy, and we're actually contracting our lungs by breathing out. So similar to breathing, at every stage of a plant's life, it goes through the same kind of dual expansion and contraction. Yeah? And I'm taking that through from, you can take a dry seed, but that's not going to grow. First, the seed has to expand and take on moisture. And that's the breath in. And then once it's got the breath in, the moisture in it, then it's triggered, and the germ of the seed, the bit that's going to produce the root, will start to activate, and the little first root comes out. So I'm saying that's one stage, that inwards and outwards, or expansion and then contraction, is forming one stage of growth. So if we track that through, that's why each stage has got two drawings. Yeah? And the drawings are to enhance what's going on first above ground and focus on the leaf emerging. And then, once the leaf's emerged, it can start to get a bit of photosynthesis going, and it can start to build more onto the root system, start to get secondary, not just the taproot. In the third diagram, the leaves are formed above ground and extend and get more established, and that allows the root system to be powered to form a bigger root system. So each stage of growth, then either some plants will then form a stem and start to go to flower and get a more complex root system, or if it was a biennial plant, like the carrots, that's the stage at which it uses the leaf photosynthesis energy to store up energy in the root. So I'm trying to fit all the possibilities into this pattern. So that could either be root forming for biennials, or that's the stage at which the stem will start to climb for annuals. And then the next stage, I'll mention, if you imagine a tree, a perennial, well, that's got to this stage of stem building, and it's got its trunk, and that stays there year on year. So in the case of a perennial, it starts at stage 5 each year, and the little shoots that we can see emerging on fruit trees now, they're like the bud stage of an annual growth, where it's got its structure and it's got tall enough, and that's the stage at which, most intense, it'll have the biggest solar collection leaf arrangement as possible, and the bud will start to form probably at the top of the stem, and the root system will extend to its maximum length. And then in the next, when the flower's forming, that's when the root will be most complex. And we've got this term called rhizosphere. Rhizo is root, sphere is ball, and this is the point at which it's very hard to tell where the roots finish and the soil begins. So that's the stage at which the plant is most capable of taking up water and nutrients from the root system. So we're trying to enhance and build a plant up so that it gets good growth in this early stage, and that means not over-fertilising a young plant, just making sure it's got enough water, not too much, making sure the soil conditions are right for it, and it's transplanted early enough to establish the next stage of growth. So just think about little transplants of seedlings. If we leave it a little bit too late and it's starting to form a stem, and then we transplant it, it's already committed itself to forming a stem and going to flower, and even though we put it into a bigger space, it's still going to go to flower as a tiny plant. Whereas if we transplanted it a couple of weeks earlier, when it was still wanting to form leaves, then it would grow a bigger root system in the new position, and then it would have more roots, a bigger root system, to be able to form bigger leaves, and therefore a bigger fruit later on. So we need to do things early enough in this sequence. And then just going on, the last couple of stages, fruiting where the ovaries of the plant will swell. And this is a kind of hybrid plant. It looks like an aubergine or a courgette on a tomato plant. And at that stage, there'll be maximum uptake of roots. And in some cases, again like the carrot, that's the stage at which all the energy will be sapped out, removed from the root. And if you dug up a plant just after it's fruiting, all the energy from the root is being pushed up and committed to the top growth. So in the case of the carrot root itself, by the point of forming the seeds, the fruit on the carrot plant, the carrot itself, the root, will be all dried up and give all of its energy to the plant above ground. Yeah? And then the final stage, the ripening and distribution of the seeds, and that can happen in lots of different ways. And then annuals will die back, but again, perennials will die back above ground, but save the root to grow through for next year, perennials or biennials. And just keep an eye on that for a minute. I'm just going to go through it. Does it make sense? Yeah. I like it because my dad did music. He was a music teacher, and there's an octave, isn't there, on the piano? 8 notes, and then you go up to the next, whatever it is. And there's also a long-term old thought about the music of the spheres. So it's medieval thinking, really, but they used to think that there were different circles around the Earth, and that they vibrated and made music. So music being a kind of interesting subject, but having 8 stages, relate it to that octave. And I don't know of any other kind of propositions like this, but this is sound. You can trust this and kind of learn it as a diagram, and then the job for you is to relate it to every single plant you ever come across and think, what stage is this plant up to? So I'm just going to go through a couple more things, which is what we eat and what's going on in more detail at each of these stages. So in the first stage of seed, I've mentioned malting and converting starches to sugar. So that's the stage at which water is absorbed, and then the radicle, the first root from the seed, emerges. At this stage, that plant is getting all its nutrients from the seed. It needs a bit of moisture, but no need to feed young seedling. So that's in terms of, if we're sowing seeds into a growing medium, we don't want any fertility in it. Fertility is unnecessary and can actually be counterproductive at that stage. So it's 0 or low fertility when we're just germinating seeds. That can be things like sand, leaf mould, perlite, vermiculite, but not garden compost and not really soil. Soil can be too strong for some seedlings. So all they need is sowing in heat and light. At the second stage, the sprout, I mentioned bean sprouts. So that's when the seed leaves emerge above ground. The root will start to branch, photosynthesis kicks in, and pretty soon we'd need to pop that seedling on, especially if it's growing amongst lots of others. So it can be individuated. So we've got individual root systems for each plant. Otherwise, in a small seed tray, they will start to compete with each other, and you will get spindly, etiolated growth where they're competing with each other. Stage 3, leaf. So we're starting to get the mature leaves, which again look different from the seed leaf, and the root be extending. And this would be perfect for, like I say, all the salads, or what we call cut and come again. And that is, if we cut off the larger parts of the leaf, but leave the growing shoot on, it'll regrow. And every leaf base that we leave on, that'll get a side shoot, and that will regrow. And we'll get a second crop of leaves a little bit later on, 2-4 weeks later. So you can crop repeatedly if you can hold the growth in leaf growth, which means lots of moisture, maybe nitrogen liquid feed. And one term here, when I'm overwintering a plant that's going to grow from one year to the next, a biennial, we have this term, a basal rosette. So all the leaves are formed at ground level, and it hasn't made any signs of making a stem yet. I'm thinking of things like mullein, evening primrose is another classic biennial pattern of growth. And yeah, if we were going to transplant seedlings, we'd want to transplant them out while they're still making root growth and forming a bigger root system into their final position, so that they can then grow on and make their stem or make their crop within enough time. Stage 4, I'm thinking of asparagus as a stem vegetable. So it's actually the shoot, but we allow it to grow up a bit. The asparagus kale is another. But yeah, thinking about eating the stem. I bought some gailan or kailan in last week, and that has a great big fat stem and a little flower on the top, just a mustard. But there you actually eat the stems, and the Chinese bunch them up. So we're increasing leaf surface area. The roots are getting to their maximum extent. And yeah, of course, yeah, I've written as above, so below on here. So whenever you look at a plant, you look at what's above ground, but try to guess and analyse what's going on below ground. I've learnt this by actually digging plants up at all stages and observing how big the root system is. And try that, but don't kill too many plants at the wrong time. But yeah, if you get a sense of the root system below ground is going to be as wide and maybe as deep as the foliage, the leaves above ground. So get an idea of how big a plant is above ground and try and project that, turn it upside down in your mind. But that's how big your roots are. And again, if you're watering, like I showed you, in a circle around a plant, you're trying to feed the youngest roots on the outside of the root ball. The central trunk root, if you imagine a tree, we don't water a tree by watering the trunk. The actual feeder roots are as far away from the tree as the canopy is above ground. So look to where the leaves finish and then down to the ground, that's the drip line, and that's where the young feeder roots that are actually doing good for the plant are. So on a smaller scale, look at every plant and try to analyse where its roots are up to. And yeah, nitrogen would be useful at this stage, and we're starting to form fibrous roots, and we might need to support the plant as it grows up and forms a stem. There are suggestions, the more we can allow plants to firm up their own stem, and that's when we're planting fruit trees, we don't want to put a stake in to support the trunk. That will actually weaken the trunk in the long term and mean that the tree is more likely to fall over. So we just stake at the bottom just to hold the roots in the soil and allow the trunk to flap around, and every time it moves it's compressing and expanding all the cells, and that's making them stronger, strong enough to allow that tree to stand up on its own. And that's another general recommendation in terms of mollycoddling, trying not to be too nice to your plants, but encourage them to survive on their own. And that's in terms of watering as well. Watering twice a week, even in the hot weather, should be enough for most plants once they're established. When you've just planted them out, you might need to water them 2 or 3 days in a row. But once they get going and they've been in that position for a while, they should be able to tolerate drying out a little bit. Stage 5, that's when we've got most intense foliage, and things like sprouts and cabbages are example of really bud crops that we're trying to grow just at that stage before flowering. The roots and soil will be interpenetrating. That's the stage at which mycorrhizal association will be most effective. So the roots have encouraged and helped a load of bacteria to basically grow in the soil to help the plant process nutrients for them. And in terms of interventions, if we mulch and spray at that stage, mulching to keep that root system moist for longer, and spraying, I'm thinking of either a foliar spray that would bring nutrients into the plant through the leaf, or it could be a spray to stop bugs landing on it. But you've got the greatest surface area, solar collecting area, the leaves are most developed. At stage 6, flowering, cauliflower is a good example of that. Pollination is the crucial thing we need to think about. At this stage of flowering, we've got maximum requirement for water, not necessarily for nutrients, but like I say, nutrients will come along a bit later on. And at stage of flowering, phosphorus would be most crucial of the main elements, and that's to enhance the flower. And at this stage, we could liquid feed. So if we liquid feed, we're putting nutrients in that can be immediately taken up by the plant, rather than having to wait, in the case of mulch, for rainwater to wash in the good stuff. So if you prepared your liquid feed, which could be things like comfrey or nettle, at least a month before your plants get to the stage of flowering. So again, it's sequencing, knowing when we need to do something in the future, and then tracking back and thinking, well, I've got to make my liquid feed a month before plants go to flower, and that's a month before they form their fruits. So stage of fruiting, tomatoes as an example, they're swelling ovaries, maximum uptake of nutrients, and potash would be handy as an extra feed there. And what do we have to do at stage of fruiting? We've got to harvest. And I'm not saying that glibly. Like with the aubergine and the cucumber, if we harvest them a bit young, then they're going to be all succulent and lovely. And if we keep picking them off, the plants are going to form more fruits. If we leave one fruit on and it gets seed, some plants, once they've set seed, they want to give up and finish. So picking things off regular, like the run beans, the more we pick off, the more will carry on forming later on. And that urge of plants to reproduce themselves, they'll do amazing things and even grow out of season or keep flowering late. If they haven't managed to set seed, they really want to, and they will carry on trying to fulfil their main purpose in life. And then the final stage, the grains are all common in terms of they'd be at the seed stage. And we can enhance the ripening and distribution and actually collect those seeds. And again, knowing when to collect the seeds, we'll do a bit more of this in the last session, but rather than some of the recommendations where, again, over-fussing, putting paper bags over flowers and seeds before they're actually ripe, generally not a good thing, and you can actually do some damage that way. But being there regularly enough and making a judgment about when the majority of seeds are mature enough to collect. And also, some plants you can actually pull up the whole plant, put it in the dry, and they'll carry on maturing the seeds even though the plant's out of the ground. So for finally allowing those seeds to get fully ripe. And also, this is the stage at which we could dig up perennial plants and divide them up and make more plants out of them. So that was all a bit theoretical, and again I'm going to throw it out to you that it's to every time you come across a plant, you've got now a bit of a guideline to relate it to, both in terms of what stage they're up to and a few tips, or at least the suggestion of what you can be doing at each stage of plants' growth. Plants look all different. That's the other side of this. And no doubt there are some, like almost, I don't know about non-flowering plants. Some plants have very insignificant flowers. But in some form, I'm suggesting that all those functions and those eight stages apply across the board to every plant. And so the task is to go away and look at hundreds and thousands of plants. And if I've got this wrong, come back to me and let me know. But it should give you an understanding. So when you meet a plant that you've never seen before, you'll be able to think, what stage of growth is it up to? And get some understanding of where it's going.